did this happen? How did one ship do all this?" General Zorath's words came out in a strangled hiss, his golden eyes burning with disbelief as he stared at the chaos on the view screen before him. His enormous head, contrary to his frail body, moved with unison as he stared into the scene in front of him. His fleet, 10,000 ships, the finest of the Zalkar Empire, was now a field of burning wreckage, scattered like dust across the void. His green claws gripped the edge of his command chair, metal creaking under the pressure. Around him, the crew of his flagship moved in a tense, hurried silence. Tactical readouts flickered on screens, showing ships destroyed faster than they could track. The human's ship, just one ship, darted through the wreckage like a predator, striking with unrelenting precision.
"General,"
Thrask, his second-in-command, ventured in a low voice,
"we have no explanation for this. The human vessel is not just outmaneuvering us, it's predicting our every move. It feels as if they're inside our minds."
Zorath snapped his head forward toward Thrask, his eyes narrowing.
"Impossible! They're primitive! We scouted them for cycles! One ship cannot—"
His words were cut short by another explosion that rippled through the hull, sending the crew staggering. The screen flashed with a bright burst of light as another of their capital ships was torn apart by the human ship's firepower. Zorath twisted into a snarl, his rage growing with each defeat.
"Send in the Spearhead Division," he ordered, his voice cold. "Have them intercept the Phantom. I want that ship obliterated."
The Spearhead Division, consisting of Zalkar's most fearsome warships, were designed for close combat. Heavily armored, equipped with energy lances capable of cutting through capital ships like butter. If they got too close, even the human ship, the SS Phantom, would have trouble escaping their grasp. Zorath knew there was still a chance to defeat the humans. That was why he hadn't retreated, even when his second-in-command had begged him to. Not yet. It wasn't over yet. The Phantom flew through the debris-strewn battlefield, quick and agile as the Zalkar's Spearhead Division closed in. The human ship, vastly outnumbered, faced the overwhelming power of the Zalkar cruisers, their plasma cannons lighting up the void as they fired in synchronized waves. Zorath's eyes moved as he saw plasma beams shoot towards the Phantom, but the human ship weaved and dodged, its engines flaring as it narrowly escaped the barrage. The Zalkar frigates responded swiftly, spreading out to form a trap, their weapons locking onto the smaller vessel. In a flash, the Phantom deployed a cluster of drones, sending them out as decoys. The Zalkar guns fired again, vaporizing several drones, but it gave the Phantom the moment it needed to escape the encirclement. Suddenly, the Phantom turned on one of the cruisers, unleashing a barrage of pulse cannon fire. The cruiser's shields flickered, then collapsed, just as a plasma torpedo from the human ship struck its core. A massive explosion tore the cruiser apart, its wreckage drifting away slowly. In response, the Zalkar regrouped. Their flagship launched a swarm of fighter drones, hundreds of them closing in on the Phantom, surrounding it. The human ship's point defense system lit up, shooting down drone after drone, but the relentless swarm kept pressing in, bombarding the ship's shields. For a moment, it looked like the Phantom was overwhelmed, but in a daring move, it cut its engines, letting the drones fly past. As they regrouped, the Phantom unleashed a pulse of energy, obliterating the drones in one powerful blast. Zorath was in a sense of shock, confusion, and desperation. His eyes twitched as he saw the Zalkar's remaining ships fire desperately at the human ship, the craft rocketing towards the flagship. The Zalkars kept firing, but the Phantom dodged through the chaos, returning fire to the enemy with its final plasma torpedoes straight at the flagship's main cannon. The impact caused the cannon to explode, crippling the massive ship. With their flagship severely damaged, the remaining Zalkar ships pulled back, retreating as the Phantom held its position, battered but victorious.
"Give me control of the device,"
Zorath growled, straightening in his seat.
"General?"
Thrask asked hesitantly as he looked at Zorath, but obeyed nonetheless. tapping a sequence into his console. The bridge dimmed slightly as the walls flickered with strange fluid light, bending and shimmering like liquid metal. A large orb in the center of the bridge began to glow softly, casting an eerie luminescence across the command deck. The observer's lens. It was an ancient relic, recovered from a distant world during the Zalkar's conquest. This device was what gave them an edge in countless wars. It allowed them to glimpse into the minds of their enemies, to understand their fears, their past. Zorath had always thought of it as his most powerful weapon, a key to unlocking the weakness of every species they encountered. The lens reminded him of all his memories of great victory on this day of overwhelming struggle.
"Activate the lens,"
Zorath ordered, his voice cold.
"Show me the minds of these humans."
Thrask hesitated.
General, the lens hasn't been fully tested on human minds. The data could...
"I said activate it!"
Zorath snapped, cutting him off. His patience was already hanging by a thread. This battle had dragged on too long. He needed answers, and he needed them now. With a reluctant nod, Thrask entered the final command. The lens flared brighter, casting long shadows across the bridge as it hummed to life. The air around it shimmered, and suddenly a blurry image began to form, a scene from inside the human ship. Zorath leaned forward, eyes narrowing. There they were, the crew of the Phantom. 3 of them stood at their posts, faces tense with concentration, but what caught his attention was the figure in the center, a woman. Dark hair pulled back, her eyes sharp with determination. Her hands moved quickly over her controls, issuing commands in rapid succession.
"That's their leader,"
Zorath muttered, his eyes locked on her.
"Show me her thoughts."
The lens flickered and shifted, and for a moment the sounds of the human ship filled the air. Voices overlapped, tense and clipped.
"Damn it, Hollis!"
The woman's voice rang out, frustration evident.
"We're barely holding on here. I need those shields up, now!"
"We're doing what we can, Aisha," another voice replied, filled with tension and fear. "This isn't just a battle anymore, it's survival!" Zorath's brow furrowed. He could feel the emotions bleeding through the lens. Fear, exhaustion, desperation. The human crew was on edge, pushed to their limits. But there was something else, too. A strange, focused determination. They weren't just fighting out of fear. There was a cold, calculating intelligence at work, even as they struggled to stay alive.
General, we can't play the scene inside the Phantom anymore. The observer's lens is mainly designed to see a person's past.
This isn't what I expected,"
Zorath muttered under his breath, cutting off Thrask. He had anticipated chaos, disorganization, a race of desperate beings flailing against superior forces. But what he saw was different. These humans were working together, fighting as one despite their fear. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, each person knowing exactly what to do in the face of overwhelming odds. Thrask watched alongside him, his own expression troubled.
General, they're not just reacting to our attacks, they're predicting them. It's as if they can see through our strategies before we even make a move.
Zorath's eyes narrowed as he focused back on the image of Aisha. Her hands flew over the controls with practiced ease, and there was something about the way she moved, something unnervingly familiar. The way she commanded her crew, the way they responded instantly with unwavering trust. It reminded him of the way he commanded his own forces. But no, this was different. There was something else at play here.
"Dig deeper,"
Zorath ordered, his voice low.
"I want to know what drives them. What are their weaknesses?"
Thrask hesitated again.
General, the lens wasn't designed to peer this deeply into human minds. The strain on...
"Do it! This is my command!"
Zorath erupted, his patience fraying. Thrask complied, and the lens shifted again, focusing more intently on Aisha. Her face came into sharp relief, and the images around her began to warp, blending her surroundings with something more abstract, flashes of memories, thoughts, emotions. Zorath watched closely, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in her armor. But what he found only deepened his confusion. Through the lens, he could see Aisha's thoughts, flashes of Earth, its people, their fight for survival. She wasn't just leading the battle. She was carrying the weight of an entire planet on her shoulders. There was anger, yes, frustration at the relentless assault from the Zalkar, but there was something else, something more profound. She wasn't fighting just to win. She was fighting to prove something. Zorath's claws tapped against the armrest, a growing sense of unease creeping through him. This wasn't the mind of a leader pushed to desperation. This was the mind of a predator, cold, methodical, calculating. He turned to Thrask.
Focus the lens on her past. I want to know everything.
Inside the Phantom, Aisha's frustration was mounting. The battle had dragged on longer than she expected. Every time they thought they had gained ground, another wave of Zalkar ships would close in. They were losing power, their shields were barely holding, and her crew was running on fumes.
Hollis!
She shouted, her voice edged with panic.
If those shields drop, we're done! I need them back up now!
I'm trying, Captain.
Hollis's voice came back, strained.
But we're out of tricks. We've rerouted everything we can.
Aisha slammed her hand against the console, biting back a curse. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had planned for this, prepared for every possible scenario, but nothing could have prepared them for the sheer brutality of the Zalkar fleet. They were supposed to be the underdogs, yes, but not like this. They were supposed to be better.
Captain,
Nathan's voice broke through the haze of her thoughts.
We're almost out of power. We need to find a way to end this fast.
Aisha's eyes flicked to the tactical display, her mind racing. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and dangerously close to being overwhelmed, but they weren't dead yet. Not if she had anything to say about it.
Echo,
she called to the ship's AI.
What's our status?
Shields are 12%, Captain, Echo replied in its calm, emotionless voice. Power reserves critically low. Enemy forces remain at 15% strength. Aisha gritted her teeth.
We're not going down like this.
Her hands moved over the controls, recalculating, reassessing. There had to be a way out of this, some advantage they hadn't yet exploited. Her mind whirled as she glanced at the crew. They looked at her with a mixture of trust and fear. They had followed her into this fight, believing she could lead them to victory, but now she could see the doubt creeping into their eyes.
I won't let us die here,
she reassured.
We've come too far.
She said the last words in a small breath, quickly switching to focus. She knew Hollis and Nathan for several years, and they had trusted her in every way. But now, even in this moment of life and death, they still trusted her, even without doubt. That little trust was enough for her to keep moving. Zorath's golden eyes narrowed as he watched the images flickering through the observer's lens. Aisha Reed's thoughts pulsed with frustration, flickers of her fear, anxiety, and something deeper. Anger. The general could feel the tension and determination, rippling off her mind like waves of heat, despite the dire situation the human crew found themselves in. The thought unsettled him. They were just humans, weren't they? Yet this Aisha seemed relentless, as if she were hunting, not simply surviving.
General, the human ship is shifting its course,
Thrask said from his console, interrupting Zorath's growing unease.
They're redirecting power to their engines, likely preparing for another assault.
Zorath tore his eyes away from the lens and scowled at the display. He saw the tiny dot that was the Phantom, weaving and darting between the debris of his fallen ships. He couldn't allow this to continue. He wouldn't.
Order our remaining cruisers to close the net,
Zorath commanded, his voice low and venomous.
No more probing. Full assault. Do not let that ship out of the kill zone.
Yes, General.
Thrask saluted sharply before transmitting the orders. The flagship's tactical officer relayed the commands to the rest of the fleet. Zorath could see the larger warships repositioning themselves to encircle the human vessel. Even if the Phantom had avoided them before, now it was a matter of overwhelming force. They would trap this human crew and destroy them, as they should have from the start. Yet even as the plan fell into place, the doubt gnawed at him. This human leader, Aisha, wasn't reacting like a cornered animal. She wasn't making desperate mistakes, and wasn't breaking under pressure. It made no sense. Zorath growled softly under his breath.
Who are you?
Aisha's grip on the command chair tightened as the Zalkar ships closed in. They were encircling her, forming a perimeter of destruction that slowly tightened. She could see the plan unfolding, classic entrapment. The Zalkar weren't letting up, and they were finally using their numbers against her.
They're trying to box us in,
Nathan muttered from his console, his voice tight with nerves.
I can see that,
Aisha replied, eyes narrowing as she scanned the tactical display. The walls were closing in. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't allow herself to panic. She couldn't. Behind her sharp, focused gaze, the frustration simmered. She had led her crew through impossible odds before, but this time it felt different. Each time she thought she had outmaneuvered the Zalkar, they adapted. It was as though they could anticipate her moves, counter her strategies before she even made them. Her brow furrowed. How?
Echo,
Aisha called, her voice clipped.
Scan for anomalies in the Zalkar's movements. I want to know if they're predicting us somehow.
Analyzing, Echo responded, the AI's calm tone a sharp contrast to the tension aboard the bridge. After a moment, it spoke again. No detectable anomalies in their ship-to-ship communications. However, their formation suggests a level of coordination beyond normal tactical adjustments. Aisha's mind raced. They weren't just reacting to her movements. They were reading her somehow. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't just a fight. It was a chess match, and the Zalkar were playing a move ahead. But she wouldn't let them win. Not yet.
Then we'll force their hand,
Aisha muttered, more to herself than the crew.
Hollis, prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're going to punch through the right flank.
Hollis looked up from his console, his expression a mix of doubt and fear. Captain, that side's swarming with destroyers. If we get close, we'll be... Hollis struggled to speak as Aisha slowly glanced at him.
I know,
Aisha sighed. Nathan looked uncertain, but nodded.
I hope you're right about this.
Aisha met his gaze.
We don't have time to hope. We make this work or we die.
On board the Zalkar flagship, Zorath watched the human ship with growing impatience. The net was closing. Soon the humans would have nowhere left to run. But then, a movement, a shift in the tiny vessel's course. They were headed toward the weakest point in his formation, toward the cluster of destroyers.
So they're going to try and break through,
Zorath said, his lips curling into a smirk.
Foolish.
They're desperate,
Thrask added, a hint of relief in his voice.
They know they can't hold out much longer.
Zorath grunted with satisfaction, tempered by the strange nagging at the back of his mind. Something about the way they were moving. It was too deliberate, too fast.
Wait,
Zorath barked, his eyes narrowing.
Something isn't right. There!
Before he could finish, the Phantom accelerated, a burst of energy propelling it faster than expected. The human ship swung sharply just before reaching the Zalkar destroyers, veering off course and diving through the gap in the enemy line.
What?
Zorath roared, slamming his fist against his command chair.
They're not breaking through! They're escaping!
They've bypassed the destroyers!
Thrask shouted in disbelief, his eyes wide as he stared at the display.
They're heading for our rear line!
Zorath's heart pounded with fury. He could feel the rage boiling over. This wasn't just a tactical blunder. This was humiliation. The humans had outmaneuvered him, and now they were going to strike at his most vulnerable position.
Redirect all firepower to the rear!
Zorath bellowed, his voice echoing across the bridge.
Stop them now!
Aisha felt a grim satisfaction as the Phantom shot through the gap in the Zalkar formation. Her crew worked in synchronized silence, the tension so thick it was perceptible. They had made it through, but she knew they weren't safe yet, not by a long shot.
Shields at 8%, Echo reported. Enemy reinforcements are adjusting course. Impact in 2 minutes. We need to hit their command ship before they regroup,
Aisha said, her voice low but firm. She glanced at the tactical display, her mind already formulating the next move. They had one shot, one chance to end this.
Hollis, prepare the remaining torpedoes, she ordered. We'll target their bridge directly.
Hollis gave a shaky nod. Torpedoes primed, Captain. Aisha stared at the Zalkar flagship on the screen. This was it. They either took out the enemy command now, or they were dead. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the responsibility of her crew's lives heavy on her shoulders. But there was no room for hesitation.
Steady,
she whispered.
We're almost there.
Zorath watched with a rising sense of dread as the human ship closed in on his flagship. How did it come to this? How had his mighty fleet, an empire's pride, been reduced to scrambling, desperate maneuvers against a single vessel? His claws dug into the armrest as he watched the display, every muscle in his body tensed. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The humans were supposed to break, to crumble under the pressure. They were supposed to be weak. But they weren't.
They're targeting us, General,
Thrask said, his voice shaking with fear.
They're going for the bridge.
Zorath's jaw clenched.
Fire everything! Stop them!
They're too fast, one of the tactical officers stammered. We can't lock on.
Then find a way,
Zorath roared.
We are not losing to these vermin.
But even as he spoke, the tactical display showed the inevitable. The Phantom was closing in, its torpedoes armed and ready. Zorath could feel the weight of failure looming, pressing down on him like a vice. The human ship's torpedoes struck the flagship's shields, and everything went white. Zorath stumbled against the railing of the bridge, his golden eyes wide with shock and fury as the smoke cleared. The Zalkar flagship had taken a hit, but their shields had absorbed most of the impact. Alarms blared and chaos erupted around him, yet his mind raced, focusing on the flickering tactical display.
Damage report!
He shouted, forcing his voice above the cacophony.
Shields at 70%, but the front arrays are severely compromised,
one officer reported, his voice trembling.
We've lost auxiliary power in sections 5 and 6. We're vulnerable.
Zorath ground his teeth. This was not just a battle. It was a crisis of pride and authority. He had led his people through countless victories, claiming worlds and resources that had fueled the Zalkar Empire for centuries. The destruction of entire civilizations was a testament to his strength. But here he was, on the verge of losing everything to a single human vessel. The Phantom had evaded destruction against overwhelming odds, and now it was his flagship that was vulnerable. Aisha Reed was cunning, an unexpected threat that he underestimated. As he processed this realization, another thought slipped into his mind, dark and consuming. Capturing Earth was no longer just about conquest. It was personal. For cycles, Zorath had focused his campaign on Earth not just for its resources, but for its potential. The human race had developed technologies that, while primitive compared to Zalkar advancements, showed signs of ingenuity. With the right influence, Earth could be molded into a stronghold for his empire, a bastion against the enemies that had threatened their borders. The humans' resolve in the face of adversity intrigued him, but it was their rapid technological growth that truly worried him. If left unchecked, they could become a formidable force, one that could rival the might of the Zalkar. But this was different. This was personal now. Aisha Reed had taken something from him, his confidence, his authority. He couldn't allow this humiliation to stand.
Redirect all remaining power to the front shields,
Zorath barked, feeling the anger churn within him.
And prepare a broadside to strike on the Phantom. We cannot let them escape.
General,
Thrask said, his voice unsteady.
We're out of time. The Phantom is already...
Zorath didn't let him finish.
Do it now!
The tactical officer complied, frantically relaying the orders to the gunners. Zorath watched the screens, his heart racing as the Phantom maneuvered with incredible speed, darting in and out of the Zalkar formation. Aisha was relentless, weaving her ship through the gaps with great precision.
How is she doing this?
Zorath thought, frustration boiling. It was as if she could sense their every move. Aboard the Phantom, Aisha felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her as she maneuvered her ship through the chaos. They had landed a hit, but it hadn't been enough. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins, driving her to focus harder, to think faster.
Full power to the engines! We need to get back to the flanks!
She shouted, her voice carrying the weight of urgency.
Hollis, prepare to launch the next volley of torpedoes. We're not stopping until we take that flagship down.
Hollis nodded, sweat glistening on his brow.
Aisha, we can't keep this up. We're outnumbered
And we're not dead yet,
she snapped, her frustration spilling over.
If we don't push now, we might not get another chance. They think they've cornered us. Let's show them how wrong they are.
With a deep breath, she set her jaw and focused on the tactical display. The Zalkar flagship loomed ahead, surrounded by its remaining destroyers. But there was a flicker of movement in their formation that caught her attention. They were starting to form a tighter net, closing in to prevent her escape.
Echo, can you determine their shield strength?
Aisha asked, her mind racing. Calculating, the AI replied. After a tense moment, Echo's voice returned with the analysis. Shields at 70%, with significant strain on the front arrays. However, they are redistributing power away from the rear. This is our chance.
Right,
Aisha said, feeling the rush of adrenaline spike.
Hollis, prepare to fire on my mark. We'll target their exposed rear flank.
On it!
Hollis replied, his fingers flying over the controls.
Now, Nathan,
Aisha barked.
Push us in, hard. We need to get through before they realize what we're doing.
The Phantom surged forward, its engines roaring with renewed strength. Aisha's heart raced as she steered them toward the flagship. As they approached, she could see the Zalkar scrambling to adjust, their ships momentarily uncoordinated in their confusion.
Firing in 3, 2, 1.
Back on the flagship, Zorath felt a surge of panic as he watched the human ship barrel toward them.
Redirect fire to the rear,
he commanded, but it was too late. The Phantom unleashed its torpedoes, streaking toward his flagship in a dazzling display of light. Zorath's eyes widened as he shouted,
Brace for impact!
The torpedoes struck with a thunderous explosion, the force rattling the flagship as energy rippled through the hull. Zorath was thrown backward, crashing against the command chair. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring as his crew scrambled to regain control.
Status report!
He barked, forcing himself back to his feet, adrenaline fueling his rage.
Shields are failing! Damage in the engineering section!
An officer shouted, panic etched across his face.
We're losing power in multiple sectors!
Zorath clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a fight for survival. The humiliation of losing to these humans ignited something primal within him, a rage that threatened to consume him.
Prepare for a counterattack,
he shouted, his voice laced with fury.
Rally our forces and strike back!
Zorath felt the anger boiling within him as the human ship surged forward again, daring to approach his flagship despite the chaos around them. The Phantom was relentless, and each movement they spent regrouping felt like a lifetime of shame. He couldn't let them keep this up.
Prepare the remaining cruisers to engage,
he commanded, fury lacing his voice.
We will crush this human rebellion once and for all.
But just as he finished issuing his commands, a new image appeared on the lens. Aisha and her crew, their faces set with determination, their ship rushing forward.
What is this madness?
Zorath hissed, anger mingling with confusion. They were rushing in? He leaned closer to the lens,
feeling a mixture of frustration and something else, a realization, a glimpse of the humans' resolve that was almost admirable. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for a future they believed in. This Aisha, with her fierce resolve, had ignited something in him, a flicker of recognition. Was she merely a survivor, or was there something deeper, something he couldn't quite place?
"Prepare for impact!"
Zorath shouted, shaking himself out of his thoughts.
"This time we will not falter!"
Aisha's heart raced as they closed in on the flagship, but Zorath's thoughts consumed him. He felt an urgency pulsing through him, fueled by the impending chaos. The lens before him displayed the human ship's approach in stark detail, highlighting Aisha's determination. He had seen that look before, but in those he had conquered, not in a foe.
"What makes you so strong?"
he wondered, bewildered.
"What drives you to fight?"
General,
Thrask's voice broke through his thoughts, tense and urgent.
they're preparing to breach our defenses. If we don't act quickly, they'll reach the engineering core.
Zorath's mind raced as he considered their options. Aisha's ship, the Phantom, was now a flurry of activity, its crew moving in synchronized chaos, working to exploit every weakness in his formation. It was more than just a tactical move. It was a statement.
"They're underestimating our resolve,"
Zorath growled, his voice low but edged with frustration.
"Rally our remaining forces. We will not allow a mere human ship to dismantle our command."
Reinforcements are inbound, but it may take time,
Thrask warned.
We cannot hold them off for long. If they breach the core...
"Then we won't let them,"
Zorath snapped, his mind racing.
"Prepare the main cannons. We will create a defensive perimeter around the engineering bay. I want everything focused on that point. We will annihilate them before they even think of breaching."
Zorath felt the familiar surge of anger, his claws tightening into fists as he watched the human ship dart toward his flagship like a persistent mosquito. It was relentless, and each second felt like an eternity. The emotions coursing through him twisted together. Rage, humiliation, and an undeniable thread of respect. The Phantom was slipping through the gaps of his defenses with an audacity he had not expected. Zorath had prided himself on his strategic prowess, yet this mere human seemed to be playing a game he had not anticipated.
General, the human ship is almost in range,
Thirsk urged, panic beginning to seep into his tone. Zorath inhaled deeply, drawing on every ounce of focus he could muster.
"Let them come. We'll show them the true might of the Zalkar."
He refocused his gaze on the tactical display, his mind racing. His people had always viewed Earth as a resource-rich planet ripe for the taking. Their technologies had begun to show promise, and if harnessed, Earth could be a critical asset to the Zalkar Empire. If he could capture it, reshape its inhabitants, perhaps even turn them into soldiers for his cause, he could secure the future of his people. The thought stirred a primal instinct within him. But this was more than conquest. It was personal now. Aisha Reed had stepped into his path and disrupted everything he had known. She was not merely a nuisance, but a formidable opponent.
General, they're closing in,
Thrask shouted, and Zorath felt his heart pound against his chest. As Aisha and her crew barreled toward the flagship, she sensed the danger coiling around them like a tightening noose. The looming shadow of the Zalkar flagship dominated her view, and the adrenaline surged through her veins like wildfire. They were so close, she could almost taste victory. "Status report!" Aisha barked, her voice steady despite the chaos.
"Torpedoes armed and ready,"
Hollis said, his hands flying across the consoles.
"We'll be in range in 10 seconds.
"Hold steady," Aisha shouted, her heart pounding in sync with the ship's engines. She felt a surge of determination sweep through her as she thought of her crew. They had fought through hell to get to this point, and they would not falter now. "We can't let them regroup. We will take the fight to them." As the seconds ticked away, Aisha's gaze flicked to the tactical display. Zorath's flagship was preparing for a counterattack, but there was a glimmer of uncertainty in their movements. "Now!"
Aisha commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. "Fire!" The Phantom erupted with a brilliant flash as torpedoes launched, streaking toward the flagship. Aisha held her breath, a mix of hope and dread swirling in her stomach. Zorath's senses heightened as the human ship unleashed its torpedoes. His instincts screamed, a primal reaction urging him to take action.
Activate defensive shields! Intercept the incoming projectiles!
The crew scrambled to obey, but Zorath could feel the fear gripping them. He could almost taste the impending catastrophe. The moment the torpedoes struck, the bridge shook violently, alarms blaring as the blast rocked the flagship.
Status report!
Zorath shouted, teeth gritted against the pain of the impact. "Shields at 40%! Damage to the aft section!" An officer shouted back, panic evident in his voice. Zorath slammed his fist on the command chair, frustration boiling over.
This cannot happen! We are the Zalkar! We do not lose to those wretched humans!
He could feel his heart racing, the weight of impending failure pressing down on him. The lens showed Aisha, her expression fierce and unwavering, a reflection of everything he both despised and respected.
"General, they're moving again,"
Thrask warned, his eyes wide. Zorath snapped back to the display just in time to see the Phantom change course. They were shifting their approach, targeting another vulnerable point in his flagship's defenses. They were relentless, he thought, gritting his teeth.
We will not let them breach, he roared. Reroute all power to the front shields and fire at will. Engage them!
As Aisha navigated the Phantom, she felt the ship lurch beneath her as enemy fire slammed into their shields. The alarms blared, the tension thickening in the air as she fought to maintain control.
Echo, how are the shields holding?
Aisha shouted, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the chaos.
Shields at 60% and falling,
Echo replied, the AI's voice calm in the storm.
We need to change our approach if we are to survive this encounter.
I know,
Aisha snapped, determination igniting within her.
We'll cut their defenses again. If we can get close enough to target their engineering core, we might be able to...
But before she could finish, the Phantom jolted violently, sending her crashing against the control panel. Pain flared in her side, but she pushed it aside, gritting her teeth as she focused on the screen.
We can't give up,
she shouted, rallying her crew.
They think they have us cornered, but we've come too far to back down. Hollis, get us back on course for the flagship.
On it, Hollis replied, urgency lacing his voice. The Phantom swerved sharply, moving toward the flagship once more. Aisha's heart raced as she felt the adrenaline surge. They were close, so close to breaking through. She could almost taste victory, but she knew it wouldn't be easy.
Keep the pressure on,
Aisha commanded, her voice fierce.
We're not just fighting for our lives, we're fighting for our home. This ends now.
Zorath watched in disbelief as the human ship maneuvered with unyielding precision, pressing forward despite the chaos surrounding them. The bravery displayed by Aisha Reed was remarkable, and yet it fueled his rage. He refused to allow himself to be outsmarted by a human. No more mistakes.
Prepare to fire all cannons on my mark,
he shouted, feeling the surge of power ripple through the flagship as his crew scrambled to comply.
We will not lose our command to this human upstart.
Cannons charged and ready, General,
Thrask called, his hands trembling at his console. Zorath felt the energy crackle in the air as he locked eyes with the lens once more, staring into Aisha's determined gaze. She was unwavering, fierce. In that moment, something shifted in him, an understanding, a realization that transcended the battlefield. Zorath's hands trembled as he watched the tactical display on the bridge. His once mighty fleet was reduced to wreckage, pieces of his grand armada floating aimlessly in the void. The humans, these insignificant creatures, had turned the tide against the mighty Zalkar Empire. The general's breath hitched in his throat, fury rising like a storm inside him.
How did one ship do all this?
He muttered, his voice barely above a growl. His officers were silent. No one dared to speak, to explain what had gone wrong. The truth was too painful to admit. They had been outwitted from the start. Zorath's eyes flicked to the central screen. The human vessel, Phantom, moved with surgical precision, avoiding fire, darting through the debris of fallen Zalkar ships like a predator. It was impossible. No human technology should be this advanced. No human strategy should have defeated their flawless tactics.
They anticipated everything,
Trask whispered, as if speaking aloud would make the realization more bearable.
They knew where we'd be, how we'd strike.
Silence!
Zorath snapped, though deep down he knew Thrask was right. It wasn't just brute force that had beaten them. It was something far more dangerous. Intellect. These humans had studied his every move, countered every formation with surgical precision. They had led him into this, and he had fallen for it. Aboard the Phantom, Aisha sat at the helm, her expression one of calm focus. She watched as the final Zalkar vessels wavered, their formation crumbling. The hard part was over. Now came the finishing blow.
"We're almost there,"
she said, her voice steady, but with an edge of tension.
"Echo, what's the status of the flagship?"
"Shields are holding at minimal capacity, Captain," Echo replied, its mechanical voice betraying no emotion. "But their defensive grid is fractured."
Aisha's eyes narrowed. She could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of every plan, every calculated risk. This wasn't just a battle. It was a war of wits, a contest of strategy. And they had won.
"Good. Let's make this count. Hollis, give me a trajectory for their main reactor,"
Aisha said, her voice sharp with purpose.
"We're taking that ship down."
"Aye, Captain. Calculating trajectory now," Hollis replied, his fingers moving quickly across the console. "Locked in, ready to fire." Aisha's gaze locked on the Zalkar flagship, now limping through space, barely able to sustain its own systems. She could almost feel Zorath's rage through the distance, his pride crumbling as each second passed. Zorath's heart pounded in his chest as his crew scrambled around him. He could see the desperation in their movements, the dawning realization that the battle was lost. His mind raced, trying to grasp onto any shred of hope, any strategy that could reverse the tide.
"They've outmaneuvered us, General,"
Thrask said, his voice shaking.
"We can't hold them off much longer."
"Then we die fighting!"
Zorath roared, standing from his command chair. He refused to accept defeat, not to humans, not to anyone.
"Prepare the remaining cannons! Target the human ship! We will bring them down with us!"
But even as he spoke, he knew it was futile. The Phantom had torn through their defenses with surgical precision, exploiting every weakness he hadn't even known existed. It was as if they had been one step ahead from the start.
"Final payload ready, Captain," Echo announced. "Trajectory locked."
Aisha took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the command interface. This was it, the final moment.
"Fire,"
she said, her voice steady. The torpedoes launched, streaking toward the Zalkar flagship. For a moment, everything seemed to slow. The silence on the bridge was heavy, as if the entire crew held their breath, waiting. Then the torpedoes struck. Zorath barely had time to react as the torpedoes slammed into the heart of his flagship. The entire ship shuddered violently, and the lights flickered as power systems began to fail.
"No!"
Zorath screamed, gripping the armrest of his command chair. He watched in horror as the main reactor exploded in a blinding flash, sending shockwaves through the ship. Alarms blared, and his officers scrambled, trying to maintain control, but it was too late. His ship, his fleet, his entire campaign, it was all crumbling before him.
"We underestimated them,"
Zorath whispered, his voice hollow. He slumped into his chair, staring at the tactical display. The human ship was still there, untouched, as if mocking him. All along, this had been their plan. They had known exactly how to beat him, how to break him. The Phantom pulled away from the dying Zalkar flagship, the fiery debris lighting up the void behind them. Aisha's face was calm, but inside she felt the weight of what they had just accomplished.
"Captain," Hollis said quietly, "the flagship is gone."
Aisha nodded.
"It was over the moment they underestimated us."
Her crew remained silent, the gravity of the victory settling in. They had faced down an empire, an alien force far more powerful than their own, and they had emerged victorious, not through brute strength, but through strategy, unity, and trust. This was how humans fought. This was how they won.
"Take us home,"
Aisha said softly, leaning back in her chair.
"There's nothing left here."
As the Phantom sped away from the battlefield, Aisha glanced one last time at the wreckage of the Zalkar fleet. They had won, but this was only the beginning. Humanity had proven its strength, its intelligence, and now the galaxy would know.